In a world driven by connections, Oman beats at the heart of global trade routes, using integrated logistics solutions from coast to coast to bring every opportunity to your doorstep, connecting you with the thriving global markets through one of the world's fastest logistics hubs and the most efficient ports, making Oman and its ever-expanding operations a smart choice for global trade and businesses. Connect to the world. Connect to Oman.
First of all, I would like to welcome all the attendees of this webinar, basically. So we would like to welcome all the attendees in Asyad LinkedIn account, as well as Asyad YouTube account with the live streaming. I'm very delighted to host and welcome Mr. Peter Terchwell. He's a global leading provider of maritime data analysis and expert and consultancies. He is also a leading journalist with 30 plus experience in the logistics and the maritime sector. Mr. Peter Terchwell is the VP of Journal of Commerce, part of S&P, well-known global. He's also the founder and the chairman of the most well-known container conference in the shipping industry, the TPM conference, and has been working with the Journal of Commerce since long time. So welcome. I'm very delighted to welcome you here and have a conversation with you, Mr. Peter.
Thank you, Ziad. It's my great pleasure to be with you today.
Good. Before I start, Peter, I think you've had enough talking about COVID disruptions. Are we done with that? Or do you still think the sector is suffering from COVID implications?
Well, we're done with the worst of the COVID disruptions that we saw. The port congestion that in some places in the world was as bad as it's ever been ever since the beginning of containerization back in the 1950s. The industry had never seen conditions like that. So that's really all over, and you can see that in the freight rates, and you can see that, the freight rates, plunging back down to earth. You can see that in the fluidity of cargo movements through ports. You can see it in the availability of containers. So from that perspective, it's a thing of the past. However, a lot of the conditions that we're seeing in the market right now are really very heavily influenced by the period of COVID. For example, we, of course, and everybody knows this is not anything new, the huge surge in consumer spending in North America and to a lesser extent in Europe that we saw during COVID has now completely reversed, and the spending that was being directed towards the type of goods that move in containers is now in many cases being directed towards travel and tourism and services. So throughout Europe, for example, the beaches are packed, local communities are complaining about too many tourists, and this has significantly affected the amount of containerized goods, where you can see this year, Ziad, that economies are holding up. We have not gone into recession the way many economists had predicted, and yet there is a freight recession underway, given how weak the containerized volumes are.
You've touched on to the change of the consumer behavior. It's also, on the positive side, basically, it's also getting, we've seen a shift towards e-commerce and digital supply chains, which also offers opportunities for the logistics sector. What's your thoughts about that as well?
Oh, for sure, because obviously the COVID was a big boost to e-commerce, and there was a lot more e-commerce that was occurring during COVID, obviously because of the conditions of the world and of society at that point in time. The thing about e-commerce is that it requires in order for it to be effective, e-commerce supply chains require a heavier involvement of technology. And because if you look at e-commerce from the perspective of an end consumer, you and me and our families, when we're buying goods on e-commerce, we have very, very high expectations in terms of our access to information. We want to know when goods will be delivered. The apps are telling us when goods are going to be delivered. If they can't be delivered, they're going to tell us when they will be. And so that demand by consumers for very detailed, very precise information about their shipments is forcing logistics providers upstream, even well into the ocean phases of the transport and the origin phases of the transport, to be more focused on visibility, and that means more focused on technology than they had been in the past.
Good, sure, Raj. Peter, I mean, also one of the key trends, basically, and that's again as a result of COVID disruption. There are beliefs that globalization is a little bit slowing down, where we are now focusing on regionalization, basically, and it's all part of risk management, and that's our key topic basically today. Yeah. And the reaction of the industry, the shippers, the change in the consumer behavior, it's all driven by risk management, basically.
Well, risk management is a major theme, if not the most important theme of the market right now, from the perspective of shippers or customers or BCOs, however whatever term you use. This was not always the case before. In fact, if you don't have to go back very long, pre-COVID by a few years, when the concept of disruption within supply chains was very periodic. There was various instances of disruption that occurred over the years. You might call the Hanjin bankruptcy would be one example. Occasionally you had longshore labor, which disrupts ports. Every once in a while you have a major weather event or a major economic event that like the financial crisis in 2009, that led to disruptions within the container shipping supply chain. But those were kind of largely seen as isolated incidents, like they happened every once in a while. But then after COVID and all of the associated disruptions, combined with the fact that you now have geopolitical risk concerns, which also was nothing that really entered the thinking of logisticians over many years. The industry really has now entered a new era of risk, the perception of risk, the management of risk, and you can see a lot of actions that are happening right now as a result of this heightened awareness and appreciation and acknowledgement of risk in supply chains.
So basically, I understand from what you are saying. Basically, is we are not going to have an ad hoc or kind of catastrophic events to realize risk, but basically it's now getting more frequent, and it's embedded in our day-to-day operations, basically.
Yes, Ziad, I completely agree with that, because now the assumption is that there will be disruption. We don't know when. We don't know how. We don't know how severe it's going to be, but we know that it's coming sooner or later. And therefore, companies that are running supply chains now have that reality very top of mind, where the bottom line or the status quo of the supply chain is one of that disruption is going to happen. It's just a question of when and how. Whereas before, that was not the default point of view. So, that's right there is a fundamental change in thinking.
What's your thoughts then, Peter, in terms of let's a little bit focus on the service providers and the shippers, basically. What do you think the industry, how they will react basically of this? I mean, Are they going to just impose additional mitigations in terms of risk, or do they need to completely change even the business model and how they do things, basically?
Well, I think one of the things that you've seen, Ziad, is you've seen new business models emerge. And in part, the emergence of new business models is a reflection of the elevated risk that is perceived to be the case by shippers. You take Maersk, for example, the global integrator of container logistics strategy. Now that goes back to 2016 in terms of its origins. But when you hear Maersk describing that, the concept of integrating ocean freight and marine terminals and seaports and inland connections, inland services such as origin and PO management and deconsolidation, even last mile, they talk about it in terms of risk mitigation, and or at least in part. And so, therefore, the concept being that if you are doing business with a logistics organization that controls assets up and down the supply chain, that by itself is a risk mitigation strategy, and so you can see this concept sort of playing out where, and I think Asyad is another example of this, where by integrating multiple segments of the supply chain into a single integrated offering, you are saying that in part at least, that the assets that you control are going to be supportive of reliability, supportive of resilience, and therefore are appealing, or should be appealing, to customers who are looking at their supply chain very differently now.
Yeah, as you rightly said, I mean, again, also Asyad started thinking basically about it since 2016. Our main strategy was developed then, and it was all about offering or moving towards integrated logistic offering. However, COVID kind of made us more convinced about what are we doing, and it expedited our growth towards that. Just to highlight for all the audience, basically, we will be having a Q&A session towards the end of our chat. Basically, I will call it a friendly chat with Peter. Good. So you highlighted basically, Peter, that if we summarize, basically, COVID disruptions created kind of risk awareness, and it became actually part of what we are doing, which led to the change of the consumer behavior as well as the business models towards integrated logistic solutions. Do you foresee more customers or more kind of providers moving towards integrated logistic solutions? Would that kick out the small players from the industry? What's your basically forecast?
Well, you can start by saying that the industry in general is experiencing consolidation. In other words, the big are getting bigger. The big ocean carriers are getting bigger. The smaller ones are getting smaller as a percent of the total. You can see this happening in the global freight forwarding space, where the big freight forwarders are getting bigger, and the mid-sized freight forwarders are having to compete against increasingly large, increasingly global 3PL organizations. I also would say that the concept of integrated logistics is relatively new. There had been efforts and attempts in prior history in the industry at least, to integrate different components of the supply chain into a single offering, largely unsuccessful. I mean, you could see what has happened with ocean carriers that started logistics companies. Going back into the early days, you saw Maersk and APL and Sealand all starting logistics businesses that ended up being very independent of them, and in many cases sold off. APL's logistics was sold off. Houston Logistics is very much of an independent company, and so there's a real divide, if you will, between the need of a logistics provider to be independent of the assets, and that has led to the lack of success in terms of truly integrating logistics capabilities into a single end-to-end offering. But now we're seeing that we're seeing organizations take another run at that, but they're doing it in different forms. Obviously, Maersk has declared, as we were talking earlier, that they are going to be an end-to-end integrator of container logistics. Integrator, by the way, is the term that is used to refer to express carriers like UPS and DHL and FedEx, where all assets throughout the entire supply chain are controlled by a single provider. But then you have different companies that are going in different directions. CMA CGM, based out of Marseille, they have acquired, they acquired CEVA. They've acquired multiple other organizations. CEVA still operates largely independently within the CMA CGM group, so they have not integrated. They did not rename CEVA as CMA CGM Logistics, for example. It's still an independent, semi-independent entity within that organization. So I only say this to illustrate the point that the concept of integrated logistics is still new. It's still somewhat unproven, and there's a ways to go, I think, before customers at scale really appreciate and see the value of these offerings.
I see one of the comments raised by the audience, Mr. Majid Karim, is maybe in line with what you just mentioned, that also it could be risky to rely on a single provider where you need to have a multi source in the supply chains, basically multiple players. Back to Maersk also, I think, had the same model of CMA CGM initially, but recently this year they announced a unified also brand for the all the multiple services they had and service providers. So, and that's again, as you said, it's debatable. You see two MLOs having different strategies towards that.
And I think that the comment that the individual made is a very good one, because one of the realities of the industry is that logistics providers tend to specialize in certain things and in certain regions, and they tend to be much stronger in some countries than in other countries. They tend to be stronger with some capabilities versus other capabilities. Many logistics companies are very focused, for example, on doing what they do very, very well and avoiding spreading themselves too thin where they're not confident that they can deliver the service quality that their customers expect. And as a result of that, you see many of the corporate logistics teams at many of the big retailers and manufacturing companies and global BCOs. A part of their job is determining who the best service providers are to provide what service. Both to make sure that they are availing themselves of world-class service wherever they can find it, but also to the point that the individual made, to avoid being too dependent on one provider, which by itself is a risky strategy.
Okay. Back to the risk management, basically, the more we get concerned about risk, the more we need to put mitigations into place. Who's going to pay this extra charge, basically?
Well, this is a very interesting question that you ask, because mitigating risk does not come without cost. So anybody who is a customer of insurance companies knows that to mitigate risk, you have to pay. We have to pay individually for our own insurance policies. Companies have to pay for their own insurance policies. They lay off risk with underwriters. And so mitigating risk comes with a cost. It's no different in the supply chain world, where companies, for example, right now have decided that many of them that it's too risky to have all their eggs in one basket in terms of sourcing. And so hence we see the emergence of China plus one as geopolitical tensions have become elevated, and now resourcing or reshoring, whatever term you want to use, is now becoming increasingly prevalent, and we can see it very clearly in the trade data. But it's not coming without a cost. For example, I wrote an article for the Journal of Commerce just within the last couple of days that was showing how a number of companies that have offshored manufacturing away from China found that the logistics were not nearly as seamless, that the costs were higher. In some cases, the quality was lower, not in all cases, of course. But nevertheless, there was a cost associated with diversifying supply of manufacturing. And the you may have seen, and some of our viewers today may have seen, a study that was released about 2 weeks ago at the Federal Reserve, the annual Federal Reserve Summit that takes place in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. It was an academic study that very clearly showed that product sourcing from when it's diversified away from China and to other countries like Vietnam or Malaysia or Thailand or Indonesia, it's associated with higher cost. So it was, essentially this fact was proven in an academic study. And so you have therefore conflicting goals. On one hand, I want to mitigate risk, but it's going to cost me. On the other hand, I'm trying to drive down costs. I'm especially trying to drive down inventory right now because I stocked up way too much, most likely in many cases during COVID, and now interest rates have gone up significantly. So my costs of carrying inventory is much higher. And so I'm trying to reduce inventory cost at the same time that I'm trying to mitigate risk through diversification. So you have a lot of different forces coming together and a lot of different priorities that are colliding, making it very, very difficult or complex environment for many BCOs to be operating in right now.
Yeah, I think, at Asyad, we are, facing lots of challenges when it comes into all of these different forces where we try to manage, but maybe being part of it, we feel it also as well as a service provider. If we, okay, then the question would be, would technology play a role in bringing this cost down, or is it also another where we need also to bear the cost as well of investing into additional technology to basically try to also create more visibility across the supply chain and have better integration?
Well, my view on this is that technology has struggled to reduce costs significantly in the supply chain. Visibility is a technology subject that has been around for a very, very long time. Many shippers still complain about lack of visibility, and you can see that right now you would think that shippers would be investing more in technology as part of a effort to make sure that their supply chains are really fit for purpose following COVID, because COVID was a wake-up call, a very unpleasant wake-up call for many companies that realized that they did not have a really strong supply chain underlying their business. So you would think that there would be quite a bit of technology investment going on right now in the aftermath of COVID, but that's not what's happening. You see that there are a number of technology providers in the logistics space or in the supply chain space that are really struggling right now, laying off employees, financials that are disappointing, and so it's not materializing. And one of the reasons why it's not materializing is that there's not in many cases, not in all cases, not a great deal of proven track record to show that the investment is going to yield the financial benefits in terms of cost savings, for example, that companies are looking for.
Interesting. It even creates more complexity now when it comes into dealing basically with these risks. We also have to think of the human capital. I mean, during our pre-session chat, you've mentioned about one of the leading MLOs retraining the entire sales team. What else is also happening in terms of human capital?
Well, from a provider standpoint, as business models change, then skill sets need to change, and people who had been selling one, I was referring to, organizations that may be changing their business model and how they have a sales team, for example, or customer support teams that might have been in the past used to selling a particular product like ocean transportation, but now they are selling and supporting activities in third-party logistics and end-to-end supply chains. And so it's a very, very different product, and it requires a different skill set. It requires different knowledge, and any time that any organization pivots to a new business model and a new strategy, the whole organization has to pivot with them. It can't just be the CEO who says, okay, we're going to go in a new direction. The entire organization has to get behind and adopt and change and evolve and transform in order for any change of business strategy, no matter what the organization is, no matter what the industry is, in order for that to be successful.
I've received a lot of questions. It seems we are going to have a quite lengthy Q&A session. Maybe as a closing remark before we move into the Q&A session, what is coming up? What is next, Peter? What's your thoughts?
Well, I think that obviously we're going into a very different era now, having left COVID behind us. The world looks very different than it did just a few years ago. Factors like risk mitigation are obviously more important than they were. But one of the things that you can come to appreciate is that the more things change, the more that they stay the same. And you do see a lot of the very traditional factors in the industry coming back into focus. They were not in focus for a few years. They were way out of focus. But you do see, supply and demand driving freight rates. You see ocean carriers saying that their costs are too high, and therefore they have to charge, as a justification for charging shippers more than they had in the past. You see shippers, despite, like we were talking before, despite all of the efforts towards risk mitigation, being very, very cost conscious. So there's a lot of familiar feeling to the market right now, and so when we look forward, it's really hard to see, in the absence of some unknown black swan event that could be the next major disruption that we see. You can almost see a sense of normality returning, where things are really starting to look familiar versus how they had been without a great deal of change. However, I would say this, Ziad. There's been a lot of commentary. If we were just to look specifically at the container shipping world, a lot of comments on social media, headlines from certain media publications about how there's a rate war going on, and how the The ocean carriers are going to start undercutting each other in order to fill up their ships with cargo, and that they're going to engage in the same type of cutthroat, winner-take-all type approach to the market that we had seen in past years. But that's not necessarily the case, because in one of the things that has happened, and this really is also relatively new, is that ocean carriers are now very aggressively and very consistently engaging in short-term capacity management. And this doesn't go back more than 6 or 7 years, to be honest with you, when carriers were engaging in started engaging in blank sailings and curtailing capacity on a short-term basis. But we can see this happening now very, very frequently, almost on a daily basis. What that means is that the old notions of supply and demand no longer hold the way they did before. Because if it was just wild supply and demand, you'd have extraordinary volatility. You would have rate wars. You would have rates in some trades being driven down to zero or near zero. But even like just take the Trans-Pacific eastbound trade, Asia to North America, the rates are up in the neighborhood of about 75%. The spot rates are since June. And this is at a time when the volumes have not improved, and there's very, very little evidence of a peak season happening in a traditional peak season happening in the North American trades. But yet rates are up. Well, the only reason why rates are up is because the ocean carriers have said, look, there's not enough volume, and since there's not enough volume, then we're gonna pull capacity out of the market. It's easy to think, Ziad, that's something that is a normalized activity, but it's actually relatively new in the market, and it has to be something that everybody considers as new capacity comes online, despite what happens with volumes, despite what happens with the major economies. This is a new reality, certainly coming out of COVID, that is going to be, I think, with us for quite some time in this industry.
So basically, you are going to have a tough time analyzing the market, given the changes also in the drivers for demand and supply. I think we had a good kind of a chat. Maybe we'll open the floor for the audience Q&A sessions, if you allow me, Peter. I'll start with the I see one of the questions from Lena Shahada. Basically, how would the decoupling, de-risking of China impact production and manufacturing hubs, supply chain, and trade routes in the future?
Well, certainly you're going to see more regionalization of trade. So in many cases, the newly emerging manufacturing hubs in South Asia, for example, are not generating the volumes that would result in there being line haul vessel calls at their ports. In many cases, the ports are not developed to handle line haul vessels. And so there's going to be increased feedering going on and increased sort of regionalization of trade. So one of the things that we've seen, and we are seeing right now, is that as decoupling has occurred, and again, decoupling is a sort of a all-encompassing phrase, but I think as we've seen more and more diversification of manufacturing, you've certainly seen more activity occurring in the what you would call the intra-Asia market, because not only do you see the feedering of finished goods growing at a pretty fast pace, but you're also seeing increased shipments of intermediate parts, because in many cases supply chains are not completely decoupled from China at all. Many analysts have pointed this out, that even if final assembly occurs in Indonesia, or if it occurs in Vietnam or Thailand, in many cases, the component parts, some of the component parts at least, are still being manufactured in China and are moving to these other markets via the intra-Asia container network. So yeah, I think that you will see growing regionalization, growing importance associated with the shorter haul or long haul intra-Asia trades.
And that would definitely disrupt even the look of basically the global supply chains and the different flow of cargo. Interesting. If we can also, there's I think two questions at the on the same topic, basically from Majid Al Abri and Khawla Abdullah. Basically, what or how to develop a resilience strategies to maintain operations during disruptions.
Well, this requires a lot of planning and hopefully, and I think this is the case for many companies, that in the past resilience was just a word. It really didn't mean much. Many companies didn't really have a plan, a real plan to bounce back or to recover from disruptive events in their supply chain. Certainly, there has been a heavy technology aspect to this because as cyber attacks have become more familiar and more frequent, you have seen more and more companies be very focused on recovering from a cyber attack because the effects can be devastating. They can be highly disruptive, and unless you are protected and have invested significant time, effort, and money into properly ensuring that your systems are protected against cyber attack, then companies know that they're very, very vulnerable, and it could be an existential threat. So I think we've certainly seen risk mitigation occur on that front. But risk mitigation in terms of supply chains is a work in progress. It requires working with your vendors, and are your vendors able to meet your requirements? What visibility do you have to your vendors and their own sourcing? What visibility do you have to your own logistics suppliers and their ability to recover? What are they telling you about how they are going to manage your cargo and your supply chain through a period of disruption that they may encounter within the ports and roads and overall logistics network? So if there's one point to make in regard to building resilience, it's investing the time in something that may or may not happen, and you don't know when it's going to happen. There may be a disruptive event tomorrow. There may not be a really disruptive event for another 5 years. But so it's very easy to say, oh, you know what, we're not going to focus on that because nothing's happening right now that's problematic at all. But actually, it's those plans that are put in place in advance that result in that result in true resilience when things happen that require a response.
We've talked about complexity and also increasing cost. There's also a question from Majid in terms of how do you explain sustainability in supply chains, basically, and reaching the world target of net zero. Maybe that would also create another layer of complexity into the whole system.
Well, certainly, and this is obviously a very important topic, and it's one that I'm very pleased that the participant asked of us, Ziad. So increasingly, companies are beginning to look seriously at abating what are called Scope 3 emissions. Scope 3 emissions are emissions created on my behalf if I'm a a shipper or a BCO, but I don't create those emissions directly. So a category or an example of that is ocean container shipping. When a vessel emits carbon into the air and my containers are on that ship, what that means is that's a Scope 3 emission. Those are emissions that I'm responsible for. My supply chain cannot be considered a carbon neutral supply chain if I am using ships or planes or cars or trains that are emitting carbon into the air and contributing to global warming. So how do you deal with that? Well, the one way to deal with it is to pay more, because it's a very well-known fact that the zero carbon fuels that are just at the very, very beginning of being used right now, methanol, for example, Maersk is building, and other carriers are building some methanol ships, that this is all just very, very early on in the process of decarbonization. And so those are going to come with a cost. And there are coalitions out there where groups are trying to pool the buying power of large BCOs for the purpose of driving down the cost of zero emission fuels, which, as they stand today, are much higher than the cost of traditional bunkers. So one of the reasons why certain segments of the maritime industry, particularly the container carriers, are pushing very, very hard at the International Maritime Organization for a mechanism to be put in place that would charge for the use of carbon. In other words, if to the extent that the cost differential is very large between carbon and carbon emitting and zero carbon fuels, well, then the zero carbon fuels are at a competitive disadvantage. As a retailer, for example, if I spend more to use zero carbon fuels for my supply chain, but my competitor doesn't, well, now I'm going to have a higher cost supply chain and I'm going to be less competitive in the marketplace. And so what is really needed is a leveling so that the cost of carbon emitting fuels and the cost of non-carbon emitting fuels, in other words, zero carbon fuels, are equal. And that right there will allow, many believe, the industry to make the significant transition to meet the global goals of the Paris Accord and to meet the carbon zero carbon goals that many countries have set, that many companies have set. It really needs to happen on a very large industry-wide scale if we're going to get to the desired result.
Interesting. I think I see also lots of questions. Again, it seems technology is a hot topic today as well. Aisha Al-Blushi is asking basically about would AI blockchain help us mitigate also supply chain risks, part of technology?
So the answer is we don't know yet. AI is still very, very new, and there are only very limited scenarios where it's being applied in the supply chain. And so it's too early to tell what the impact of AI is going to be. AI is a big buzz phrase. As we know, everybody's talking about AI. The technology companies have seen their stock prices get a big boost because there's going to be this huge rush of demand for AI types of services, without any question that these will permeate the logistics world and will have an impact. But it's a little bit unclear so far what that impact is going to be. Blockchain is another area. We were talking about blockchain about 5 years ago, how it was going to be the true breakthrough that inefficiencies within the logistics system needed in order to make a big leap forward. But it really didn't take off. And I remember at the beginning of TPM, I was so excited about blockchain. I think in about 2018, that at the very beginning of TPM, I got up in front of the audience and I started talking about blockchain and about how this is going to be a transformational technology in international trade and international logistics. And then it didn't happen. So I got a little bit ahead of myself on that one. But I do think that shipping is a very conservative industry. It is a slow industry to adopt to technology. In general, this is still a very human relationship-driven industry. It has not been disrupted in any significant degree by technology up until now. Certainly not like the taxi industry, where you have Uber and Grab and ride hailing, which has completely turned the taxi industry upside down. You haven't seen anything like that enter the international shipping and international logistics world, at least not yet. And so I think that what we're going to see, just in answer to your question, that we're going to see slow, methodical, and probably not revolutionary transformation due to technology.
I mean, in terms of shipping, that could be the case, but there's also other opportunities, or maybe the different elements of the supply chain other than shipping could adapt these technologies in a more quicker approach. Definitely shipping is very traditional in nature and will remain. It's part of the shipping industry identity, basically. Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, Ziad, I would add that that there are certain segments of what you might call the end-to-end supply chain that have seen some really significant advances in technology. For example, last mile, just deliveries. Uber Eats or other or Grab. When you're the routing of local delivery is very algorithmically based. You've also seen quite a bit of automation enter into warehouse technology, which is, some of it is absolutely extraordinary. A technology that is certainly industry leading in terms of its sophistication. But when you talked about the traditional sort of ocean container shipping industry, that portion of the supply chain is still a bit of a backwater when it comes to technology. That's the point I wanted to make.
Oh, I think we are done with the Q&A session. As a closing remark, basically, I think we've discussed many topics. We've discussed risk management, the complexity in terms of changing the business models, the move towards integrated logistics solutions, and then we've also discussed the implications in terms of human capital, technology. We've discussed sustainability also getting important, and will add another layer of complexity. My views, I think we've passed the ambiguity or kind of the shock of all of these disruptions, and the industry is trying to readjust now and figure out kind of a more resilient approach. Planning, you've discussed about the importance of planning as well. It seems we have to be more innovative to also, because we have to deal with all of these complexities, and all of them will increase the cost, and that will basically slow the very good progress made in the past many years when it comes into trying the pressure to bring the transportation cost down. Means we have to be more innovative, otherwise it's going to be very expensive.
Right.
Any closing remarks from your side, Peter?
No, other than just I very much appreciate the invitation from yourself, Ziad, and from Asiad to participate with you. And I hope that those of you who have joined the session today, that this was interesting for you. I certainly appreciate the opportunity to participate, and I wanted to thank you for that.
Thanks, Peter. I mean, we are not yet done with 2023, but you were named the person of 2023 by the New York, New Jersey Freight Forwarding and Brokers Associations. Congratulations for that, basically. And we are very honored to have you here with us, sharing your knowledge. It was very informative. I can see the positive feedback from all the audiences, and wish you all the best, Peter. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Ziad, and thank you to all of your colleagues.
In a world driven by connections, Oman beats at the heart of global trade routes, using integrated logistics solutions from coast to coast to bring every opportunity to your doorstep, connecting you with the thriving global markets through one of the world's fastest logistics hubs and the most efficient ports, making Oman and its ever-expanding operations a smart choice for global trade and businesses. Connect to the world. Connect to Oman.